Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As ever, welcome to Brooklands. Fantastic to see so many of you tonight, and thank you for, as ever, supporting the Trust. A special welcome to our guests and new members. If you're first time here, you're very welcome, and we hope to see you again very soon. I'd like to also offer a special welcome to our new commercial operating officer, who's here for the first time. She's been in the job 4 days and she's still here. Would you welcome Amanda Squires, please? Now, when I started running these events 5 years ago, I used to say to Alan, do you think we'll get this many people through? And used to worry if we got 10 people. Tonight is a good example. I now worry that I can get all of you in here. It's a kind of a nice problem to have, so thank you. Now, what I want you to do tonight is to imagine that it's just you in a bar, sitting next to a table where three gentlemen who should probably know better are going to discuss the land speed record and its history here at Brooklands. Forget the fact there are other 239 people listening as well. Our first guest to be part of this discussion is one of the Campbell family dynasty. Malcolm Campbell's grandson and land speed record holder in his own right. Will you please welcome Don Wales? He sat in the right place as well, so we're doing well.
I'm up first, so I sit in the middle.
So next to welcome a man that is no surprise that he's here. I believe he's driven the Napier route more than John Cobb did, but he'll probably correct me as he does on most things. Will you please welcome our former director and CEO and now VP of the Brooklands Trust, Allan Winn. Now, as we're in the bar, finally the man who's going to buy the first round and keep everyone in order, our great friend, Editor-in-Chief of Autocar magazine, Steve Cropley.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this event tonight. It's fantastic, as Steve has already said, to see so many of you. I think, I guess you're aware of it, but the fact that you come to these things and pack the place out, not only does the organisation so much good, but it also makes it easier for us to improve the quality of the speakers. They want to come and talk to you because there are so many of you. You can see some quality here, of course.
Tonight is the exception.
When we decided to do this, it was because really it was a consciousness of Brooklands' role in early land speed record setting. You'll be aware that in the very early motoring age, the land speed record setting was owned by the French and the Germans largely. And it was after Hugh Lock King invested in this place and brought the British motor industry and motor racing on so quickly that the British came to play such an important role in it and eventually dominate it. And the domination is what we're going to hear about. We've organised these gentlemen to represent two of the proper speed kings. Alan is going to talk a lot about Cobb, plus others. And Don is obviously going to talk about his family plus others. But it's the role of Brooklands that we want to feature. Alan, as Steve said, has probably occupied the seat of the Napier Railton more than Cobb did himself. He'll tell us in a minute. Don is a land speed record holder. It's amazing. Fancy that. You can tell us about that. Yeah, I know you. Hold the modesty, mate. Yeah.
Oh, I bet.
And we have a third expert tonight. He's not going to get credited, or he doesn't want to be credited, but in fact, The bloke that has done an enormous amount of the picture research that you're going to see is Tim Morris, hiding over here, but he's responsible for... And so we're just going to sort of rattle through this according to a script I have, and script is a bit of a over exaggeration, but we're going to start.
I've not seen a script.
Well, there's a piece of paper there.
That's my crib sheet.
But we're going to start really in the pre-Brooklands, or sort of running up to Brooklands era, aren't we? We're going to talk about the people who started it before either of the gentlemen that you're representing tonight.
Yeah, obviously, as you said, the initial land speed records, nobody sat down and said, let's have a land speed record, but people started going fast and saying, has anybody gone faster than that? And a lot of it is down to people like Janazzi with his electric bolide, which hit a massive 40 miles an hour or something, and held the land speed record as a result. And then he streamlined it and went even faster. But all that stuff was being done on public roads. In fact, the French kept allowing the land speed record to be set on public roads right up until the mid-20s, when Thomas and Eldridge were fighting it out on the road at Arpaillon, just down the road from Marlery.
I was reading in Don's book, which he has here. Look at that.
I prepared earlier.
I have read this tome. It's worth finding. But one of the facts that I teased out was that the land speed record went in 2 years from 40 miles an hour to 75 miles an hour. Apparently, so they got on with it, didn't they? I mean, it was even well before World War I. It was considerable speed.
Oh yeah.
It was electric cars to start with, which I obviously got involved with later on as well. But initially, the electric car got it going, and then steam car, and then the invention of the starter motor and petrol engine really gave it a kick up the backside for it to go faster. But the land speed record is going to be 120 years old this year in December the 18th, in 2 months' time.
Is that set according to the rules we now understand? Because the rules changed, didn't
they? Did change. Initially it was over one direction, and you could do it in almost down a hill, and you could do it with the following wind.
So you waited for the wind to blow? And
absolutely, yeah.
Put a sail up?
But I think the first records that were two-way were here.
Yeah.
Is that not right?
And one of the complications in this whole land speed record story is this thing about one-way, two-way, following wind, driver's cap on backwards, all that sort of thing. Because
you've been doing a lot of that, though, cap on backwards.
Yeah, I've seen you do.
Because the official land speed record actually went down. The numbers came down in the period immediately before the First World War, when this changeover happened, and where people in the States doing this one-way stuff, I think it was Oldfield managed to get one of the Blitzen Benzes up to about 140 something miles an hour, which was never accepted as a record, because it was...
He didn't go the other way.
There was only one direction, and the Americans didn't know how to make timing equipment.
So that thing... didn't want to.
So that's not changed at all, is it?
But that thing about a measured distance, an hour to turn around and so on, when is that, the 120 years?
No. Initially it was one way, so you didn't have to turn around, obviously. It was just after the First World War, wasn't it? When the rules changed that it had to be done within an hour. And the two-way average.
And then various other little bits and pieces were introduced, like, for instance, the car had to have four wheels, and that led to the big kerfuffle with the various American Lockheed Starfighters without wings in the 60s, where the started off as three-wheelers and so forth.
Which is what my uncle was up against.
But also the problem with trying to make them as real cars. So, for instance, there was this huge kerfuffle when Eldridge and Thomas were fighting out again at Arpaillon in 1924, because Eldridge's car didn't have a reverse gear.
Reverse gear.
Yeah. Oh yes, indeed. Mephistopheles.
Yeah. So all that sort of thing. It's been refined over the years. But yeah, the principle of there being a record against which people could set the targets, it'll be 120 years.
So let's discuss who the big men were pre-Campbell. Campbell is the first of these, isn't he? The first of these big men we're discussing.
Yeah.
But who were the big guys that Campbell exceeded? Campbell
succeeded. Yeah.
Lee Guinness. Lee Guinness was one.
Yeah.
Parry Thomas, who came along a little bit later.
But before that, I guess the guys who put the biggest stamp on the land speed record were probably the Benz company, with the creation of the monstrous so-called Blitzen Benz. But even before you got to that, because there's a very interesting set of pictures just coming up. 1906, Fred Marriott had the land speed record with this amazingly flimsy Stanley steamer.
Yeah.
It literally was, it looks like an upturned canoe. And when you see photos of the crash that finished its career, it was just an upturned canoe on top of
phenomenal
of a kettle.
Phenomenal speed of it.
But it was doing over 120 miles an hour. And one of the interesting things was that got the record in 1906, and I think it set it first at about 121 miles an hour, and its last gasp was 127 miles an hour, and that was doing that when Colonel Holden was designing this track here, and the measure of the speed with which things were advancing in the motor industry at that stage was that Holden designed the slowest corner on the circuit here, the members banking, the bit inside the museum grounds, for a hands-off speed at the top of 120 miles an hour, which was a bit over a mile an hour slower than the outright absolute land speed record of the time, in 1906, when that design was being done.
That's ambition, isn't it?
Yeah, and so he was assuming that the people were going to be lapping here faster than the then land speed record.
Wow. How did, just to complete the story, how did Fred get on when he crashed at 127?
He stepped out
faster. Yeah, he actually crashed the following year, and they estimated he was doing 140.
And he was okay?
Well, he was okay apart from an eyeball being detached.
and a doctor on the scene actually picked the eyeball up and put it back in.
With a teaspoon. With a teaspoon. As everybody walks around with a teaspoon, obviously. So pop eyeball. Yeah, and he was fine. Yeah.
Okay, so that's Marriott. I've got Hemery here. Who's
Now, Victor Hemery was a journeyman driver, one of the first sort of, pay me some money and I'll drive your motor car type guys. And he came here with one of the monstrous, the so-called 200 horsepower Benzes, the 21.5 litre four-cylinder monster, and set the land speed record in 1909. He also set some other records here. This is one of the few pictures of him. Her Majesty's Motoring Press were not very good at taking pictures of people breaking records in the early days. We have very few pictures of either Hemery and indeed Hornstead with their big Benzes.
Probably didn't stand still long enough.
Yeah. But also, I might be wrong on this, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but he broke the record, Hemery broke the record in 1906 as well, in a Darroch. Now, I know someone in the audience might correct me on this, but he broke the record in 1906, and then my grandfather bought that car from him. It had won the Vanderbilt Trophy as well in America.
Wow.
My grandfather bought that car in 1909, I believe, and then that's the car that he christened Bluebird, I believe.
So that was the first Bluebird. Was that a racing car or a land speed record car, or was it?
No, it was to be a racing car, but I'm sure I've jumped ahead there. But I've just, whilst we were talking
But I think that was
the
reincarnation of that car, of course, was at Goodwood this year. They're said to be that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, because it was restored, recreated in New Zealand using the original.
I didn't know that. But
but anyway, just while we've got this picture up here, this is a fascinating picture because it's Hemery, not with the Benz, but with the 15-litre Lorraine Dietrich Vieux Charles, which of course is in the museum here, and that car came here and broke these records in 1912, even though it had been a complete failure in the French Grand Prix that year. All 4 of them failed. But the car was brought here, set a whole lot of records, and then a certain captain brought it back here in 1920, and it won the first post-First World War race here.
It is the wonder of this place, isn't it?
That car lives here currently under restoration.
Yeah, staggering.
So, but anyway, those were and that of course is effectively a Blitzen Benz. That's based on the RD Benz, which is the 15-litre car, and then there was the 22-litre car, this one here.
Isn't that fabulous?
The amazing thing about that is, of course, it's on artillery wheels. So can you imagine going racing on artillery wheels?
Just before before I lose the thought, because it's a thing that happens to me, just to give us the Bluebird. Give us the story of Bluebird. Where does this name Bluebird come from?
Well, obviously, grandfather used to race here. I mean, he first came here, I think, about 1907, 1908, and was racing motorcycles to start with.
A young guy.
Oh yes, yeah. He was driven. I mean, he really was attracted to all things speed. I mean, there's all sorts of stories. I can come on to the Bluebird one. I can go on to the first one where he was trying to find out at a very young age of how fast a push bike could go, and he's pedalling down a hill in Kent, Bickley Hill, at the age of about 10 or 11, pedalling like mad, trying to find out how fast this push bike could go. And he's gone across the crossroads and nearly knocked over 2 old ladies. And there's a policeman on the other side of the road who notices and arrests him. So he's in court the next day in front of the magistrate. And the magistrate takes a very dim view of this incident with this unruly youth.
Speed-crazed youth.
Yeah, and my grandfather is charged with riding a bicycle, endangering life and limb on the public highway of 30 miles an hour or something stupid, whatever it was they estimated his speed at. And I can see the judge putting the black cap on as he's passing sentence. and he says, Malcolm Campbell, you stand before me charged with endangering life and limb on the public highway. I'm going to fine you 30 shillings. And I want that to be a lesson to you, and I never want to hear the name Malcolm Campbell associated with such speed ever again. True story.
What a story.
But also later on, in the same court, same day, the next defendant was charged with wife battery, beating up his wife. He was found guilty and fined 5 shillings. I don't advocate any of that, but there's only 5 shillings beating your wife up.
Times changed.
Yeah. So, I mean, but he was just always driven to speed. And the first time was with his push bike, and then his first trophy was on a motorbike, a little gold coin medal for an endurance race from London to Land's End. And then he won it 3 years running just to shut his friends up to say it wasn't a fluke.
Do you want to just give us a quick burst of Bluebird?
Quick burst. Yes, I'm sure a lot of people know the story, but there's an awful lot of fact and fantasy about my grandfather, and I'm not quite sure how we try and prize out what is fact, what is fantasy, what is pure self-promotion.
Because he was big on self-promotion.
He was indeed, yeah, very, very much so. He liked himself a lot. But with the story that I like, which I think I've probably embellished a little bit as well, because I like to tell a good story, that the 2 versions of this story are that he was racing a car here at Brooklands, not giving him the success that he wanted. It called Flapper 1, Flapper 2, and he was about to christen the car Flapper 3. And one version of the story is that a friend told him about this play called The Bluebird of Happiness, which was on the Haymarket Theatre up in London. And my grandfather thought, oh, well, I'll call my car Bluebird. That's one version. The other version is that he was actually in London watching this play. And it's a fairy story about children looking for the elusive bird of happiness, which is just out of your grasp. And he thought, well, this is a great story. It's all about trying to improve yourself. And he just thought it's a great story. I'll call my car Bluebird. And in drove home, woke up the local ironmonger and bought every tin of blue paint and painted the car blue himself. Which that bit is obviously true. It's whether he went to the Haymarket Theatre and actually saw it or not. And I think my uncle has embellished the story that he actually went to see it.
That's Donald.
Yeah, that's Donald, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And so he then drove the car here with the paint still wet, lots of paint still on him, and there's a fabulous painting that Jack Vettriano did as part of the Bluebird series. And he christened it Bluebird. It was 2 words in those days. Yeah. And won the first race with that car. And so everything was Bluebird from there on in. There's more.
Pause.
There's more.
Yep, I know. I'm just fascinated with this bloke's name, L.G. Cupid Hornsted. Was his name really Cupid?
It's in inverted commas, the Cupid.
Okay, right.
And I can't remember how he became christened that, but another story.
But that is he.
Yeah. But he got the record in 1914.
This is the artillery wheels, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a bit crude.
And I'm sure he didn't race it with the. Surely he didn't use those heavy mud and snow tyres, but these were amazing vehicles, and because you could just gear them up, and they had the power to do it, and of course these cars lived on.
Yeah, torque, wasn't it?
Afterwards, because Zabrowski had one of these cars post-war, and indeed his car was dismantled and the gearbox out of it went into Babs, which we will come on to later on. So they had a great deal of life, and there's 2 of them now running. Again, the factory has one, and the Bill Evans one has just gone to Hermann Leyer in Germany, so there are now 2 Blitz and Benzes running, which are fabulous things.
The next name that I have here has the initials KLG. Ken Elm Lee Guinness. Tell me about him, somebody.
Guinness family.
KLG being a spark plug.
There was Ken Elm, and there was Algie Lee Guinness as well. And it was Algie who had the V8 Darracq for a while, the car that Mark Walker now has, the 1902-1903 Landspeed car.
Is this...
and they are part of the Guinness dynasty.
Right, so I was going to say Guinness means... Yeah.
Just to some people, or spark plugs to others.
but K. Lee Guinness, as he always styled himself, got hold of the wonderful 350 horsepower Sunbeam, which is going to feature later in this story.
Was he a works driver for
Sunbeam?
Or did he just manage to get his hands? He didn't own it, did he?
But it's a case of Louis Coatlan, the Sunbeam designer, works director. Rated Guinness, and he got to.
So I know my grandfather had problems after that, trying to get hold of it.
Yeah.
How did life go on for these blokes? I mean, did they all come out every Saturday afternoon and have a big face-off, or did things happen separately?
Record breaking here was quite interesting because records were set as record attempts. So you didn't get a lap record or the land speed record in the middle of a race or whatever. And the record breaking here tended to happen towards the end of every season. October was a good time for breaking records when the motor racing calendar was getting a bit thinner, and they would have sort of record breaking sessions at the end of the season. They were done at other times as well, but the vast, a big percentage of the records.
A bit like Bonneville.
Almost a sort of speed week where people would bring out stuff they knew they were going to have to rebuild for the winter, over the winter, so they might as well drive it balls.
Blow it up,
at the end. But this car, the important thing about this car and the land speed record that it set here was that this was the last time that the record was set on a closed circuit. And even though Brooklands was a very fast track, at the time it was the fastest track in the world, but it wasn't fast enough. The space just wasn't great enough, because the railway straight is less than a mile long. And if you're timing even over a flying kilometre and you've got a corner at each end, clearly you are not able to develop the sort of speeds. And the thing is, of course, that the car here got a world land speed record of about 122 mile an hour. By the time Campbell got it onto the sand at Pendine, he was able to get up to 150.
So the next
same basic car.
Right. The next name that I've got here is associated forever with Pendine, which is the transition you're talking about from circuit to. So Pendine was the sort of go-to place for all of them, was it?
Yes, in the UK.
It's the best. It's the best beach in the UK for that sort of thing, because you could get about 6 or 7 miles.
6 or 7 miles of straight sand,
Yeah.
but usable probably up to 5.
Yeah.
So Parry Thomas, big name. He's you know, I'm not an expert, but I've heard of Parry Thomas. He died at Pendine, didn't he? But he did a lot of good stuff before.
Yeah, Parry Thomas was.
And he's central to this history.
He is, absolutely.
Okay.
Very important.
You know, people probably know the story. He was chief engineer at Leyland Motors, designed the eccentric but wondrous Leyland 8, of which they made a production run of 18, and the factory actually gave him 1 or 2 of those cars, which eventually developed into the Leyland Thomas, which was a successful racing car here. He came here, he set himself up, Thomas Inventions Limited, which was later after his death.
But he also lived here, didn't he?
Yeah, he lived in the Hermitage, inside the track.
Yeah, he lived on the house.
Really living above the shop.
So he really lived the job, didn't he?
Again, an odd character, brusque exterior, sarcastic, loud, boisterous and everything else. And this is a guy who funded a cot at Great Ormond Street. Yes, totally different sides to his character, but he had a real reputation for, he was probably the archetypal martinet. But he got into land speed record stuff through buying the last car that Zabrowski had commissioned. Louis Zabrowski had started off the mega airship brigade here with Chitty Bang Bang 1 and 2 and 3, and then the last car that Clive Gallup built for him was the so-called Higham or Higham, depending on how you pronounce your Kentish place names, special. The people who bought it from him called it Higham, the house, but the Higham Special was a really crude frame with a 400 horsepower Liberty World War I V12 aircraft engine in it, the biggest engined car ever to race here at 27 litres, and that became went through a whole series of modifications as Babs. He kept on streamlining it, but it was one of these things. The thing, if you look at it now, it is a really crude old dog.
It is.
And Thomas saw his window of opportunity. He was using a bigger engine than other people were, and with the land speed record being where it was, sort of hovering around the 150, 155 mile an hour mark, with a 350 horsepower Sunbeam, if you've got a more powerful engine, you should be able to go faster with the same basic technology.
Right.
And so he was then heading around the 170 miles an hour bracket, and he got the land speed record on Pendine, and it's interesting. Don and I both had the privilege. 3 years ago, was it?
2015.
3 years ago. We were on the sand at Pendine 90 years to the day since his grandfather
first to do celebrating 150 mile an hour. First to do 150.
There's a great picture in here of Don on that day, driving on Pendine sand.
Driving the Sunbeam. That was a great day.
It was a great day.
Yeah.
The pictures on the front here are of the 2 cars being exercised. We took the Railton down there as well that day, and the 2 cars being exercised on the sand. And when you're on there, it's a much better place than on a closed circuit, and it's much better than a straight gravel road in France, because it's a bit wider and all that sort of thing. But you feel the drag. It's not an ideal place to go.
It's not.
So the rolling resistance.
The Railton normally needs 4 people to push start it. It really needed 6 on the sand.
Really?
And you could feel the sand tugging, especially with the Sunbeam. You could actually feel the sand tugging at the steering of the car while you.
I was there myself, and Don was there dressed or very similarly to his grandfather, and the photographs, as you'll see, are remarkable because there is a family resemblance, and there was certainly a resemblance in apparel, wasn't there? And it was a surreal moment.
The rest of us wouldn't have the nerve to wear a pale blue sweater, but...
well, my grandfather was a good-looking bloke, though, wasn't he?
He was. Okay, so we've got a bit of video coming up, but let me just ask where was Campbell... So Parry Thomas gets the record, things go wrong for him, he dies, the car gets buried, right, on Pendine, and exhumed later. Where's Campbell during this time?
He had the sunbeam that we've already discussed, and he got as much out of the sunbeam as he possibly could, and he then decided that he needed to build his own purpose land speed car, and started to get that done. He was aiming for 180 miles an hour with that, and the car was basically designed and then built I forget where it was built now. Anyway, it was finished off at Povey Cross in his house.
But the thing was that Thomas grabbed that moment because Campbell's first purpose-built land speed record car took far too long to build. And so there was this window of opportunity where Thomas knew that the writing was on the wall because Babs, no matter how many streamlined fairings you put on the front axle, it was not ever going to be a 200-mile-an-hour motor car.
Parry Thomas was there.
Yeah.
He was at Pendine. He actually helped push the car out of the sand.
Did he?
Yeah, he was down at Pendine with my grandfather. I think the story is that he was in the sand dunes with a pair of binoculars. But because the sand was so soft and conditions were so bad that the car started to sink, and they had to get it onto metal plates. And Parry Thomas was one of the people to help push it onto the plates, because they were rivals and competitors, but I think there was a healthy respect between the two of them, and also different.
And genuinely, those two did race each other here.
Yes.
So the 26.
So Babs raced here.
Babs raced here, yes, but Campbell and Thomas were racing each other and things, everything up to British Grand Prix level, because Thomas built 1.5 litre Grand Prix cars for the unsuccessful for the 26-27 Grand Prix. Campbell, of course, was racing Bugatti in those early Grand Prix, so they were actually head-to-head competitors in racing as well as in the land speed record stuff.
Gotcha. So Tim, what should we be doing? Should we run this?
Okay. We're going to go and buy another pint while you lot watch this.
So what we now have is some Malcolm Campbell video. This is where we get serious about Malcolm Campbell.
And we shouldn't let it pass, of course, there's great movie-tone footage of Malcolm Campbell because he was director of British Movie Tone.
Absolutely.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So this goes to your point about how he was so
good on
very
self-promotion.
publicity conscious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing, just to go back a little bit, that we must really emphasise what a centre of attraction, what a centre of excellence Brooklands became, because it attracted all of these people who wanted to go fast, and all of the engineers or mechanics who wanted to be part of this new world of motoring. And the only place that they could come to was Brooklands. And Parry Thomas really was, I think, almost the galvanizing catalyst for this. Because when he set up his own engineering business, he also got Thompson and Taylor involved. And without Thompson and Taylor, we wouldn't have had Reed Relton, who also helped design cars as well, which my grandfather tackled him.
That Bluebird, I was going to say, it's such an extraordinary looking car when you contrast it with the cars we've seen previously. Which
the last one.
The one that was in the... Well, how did that come to be? Who designed it? Where did you know?
Well, I mean, my grandfather's Bluebird, it evolved and changed over the years of its history. The first one that was built in 1927, 1928, then evolved over the years into the monster that went on to Bonneville in 1935.
So it's the same car?
It's the same car, stretched and changed. It's a bit like Trigger's broom, I think. It sort of ended up with being...
It's the same frame rails.
Yes. And,
and I think the steering gear lasted most of its life.
Yeah, I think that's about right. But everything else was...
It started off with a Napier Lion engine, which was the go-to engine.
Yeah.
It was saddled with a fairly unfortunate gearbox designed by Mr. Maina, which was going to do wonderful things, but weighed about as much as a London bus and didn't actually change gear. And then it was refined, and this is where the first bit of glue that binds this whole story together comes in. You've got Parry Thomas, but you've also got Reed Railton, and although the original Bluebird was designed, the main design was done by Amherst Villiers of Villiers Supercharged 4.5 litre Bentley, all that sort of thing fame. It was Reed Railton who was then the go-to man to try and get your land speed record car to work properly, and he then got involved and gradually.
Railton was just an inspired engineer who was in the Brooklands.
He came to Thompson and Taylor. Well, after Parry Thomas was killed, the company, rather than Thomas Engineering, it became Thompson and Taylor. Ken Thomas and Ken Taylor. And then they employed Reed Railton to be their designer. And
Railton was their wonderful asset.
Yeah, absolutely. He was their mad designer type person for everyone to come
obviously
to.
Obviously prolific producer of cars too.
Yes.
All sorts of things. Because before he came here, he'd done the Arab sports car, and then obviously he was involved in Thompson and Taylor with the Riley Brooklands, turning the wonderful little Riley 9 into a sports car. That was started off by Parry Thomas, and then Reed Railton got involved in that. Reed Railton did the chassis for the ERA. He did obviously Cobb's cars.
So he's, as you say, the glue.
Yes.
What's happening? What's going on here?
Well, that's grandfather. That's grandfather's first car. He left home quite early on after a bit of a row with his father, and ended up at apartments, and convinced one of his neighbours that he needed to have a car. And my grandfather, he didn't have a car at the time, and convinced this chap that he needed to buy a car, and that my grandfather would teach him how to drive the car. And my grandfather hadn't driven a car at all, so he managed to sort of blag his way into that. And the mechanic who helped my grandfather pick a car then taught my grandfather how to drive it with a 5-minute lesson, and my grandfather then drove it back to the apartments and then taught the owner of the car.
He sounds as though a persuasive bloke. Do you find this runs in the family? Can you persuade people to do stuff?
I wish I could. It's almost impossible. I try. But I mean, yes, he was an incredibly driven man, and I'm sure we're going to touch on some of his personality traits and everything else later on. I mean, he wanted to be the first person to fly as well, and built his own plane.
Here.
Yes, that's a picture from World War I where he became a ferry pilot.
Oh, and another. Yeah,
that's the one. He built that himself.
Did he?
In a shed in Orpington somewhere. He had spent many hours and a lot of his own money building this plane, underpowered with a motorcycle engine, and he and some mates eventually decided that they were going to launch this thing, and the locals said, no, man isn't supposed to fly. This isn't natural. And on this strawberry field, which was going to be his runway, they formed a cordon at the bottom. And my grandfather thought, well, I'm determined enough to get this plane in the air. These people will clear off out of the way. And the people at the end were quite determined as well, and they weren't going to get out of the way. So as the two were coming head on, grandfather pulled back on the stick, and this thing sort of managed to sort of hop over them, belly flopped into the strawberry fields. There's strawberries and wings and propeller flying everywhere. Grandfather then realised that this thing was underpowered, so they rebuilt it with a view of putting a bigger engine in it. That still didn't work, so he thought, well, actually, I need to start again. I'll put it into an auction. And he put it into an auction, hoping to get his money back. It cost him about £750 or something, and the auction got stuck at £270, and he was at the back of the auction room and put up his hand and said, and 30. So at £300, he bought his own plane back. He put it into the auction the following week, and it sold for £25, which was the commission for the previous sale. But so he gave up flying temporarily and then got back into racing.
But that was the start of a long and successful career as a crasher of aeroplanes.
Yes. There's other lots of stories of him trying to find a decent bit of sand in Africa, and he crashed the plane once there, and then he was told about
finding sand as a place to run a land speed.
For that, yes. But that is at the time when he'd obviously done Pendine, and he was thinking about Daytona, but Henry Seagrave was already going out to Daytona.
So he's another great name that came into
just coming into it, yeah. And he was told about this place in the Sahara Desert, but he crash landed there and got captured by the locals and managed to escape from them. Then he was told about a stretch of sand down in South Africa, Vernock Pan, and if I remember rightly, he was a passenger in this plane that crashed on takeoff. It flew into a tree. And he was a passenger, but he badly cut his face and nose and was in a bit of a state. But they patched him up, put him into another plane, and that crashed on takeoff as well. And so he ended up in hospital.
What was it? What held him up? I mean, it sounds as though he was somewhat hand to mouth. Persuasive in.
Well, he inherited a little bit of money from the family because they were diamond merchants, and again, there's all sorts of stories about how and the family fortune was accumulated and what happened. One story, if I can be so bold, is that, and I'm not sure which is fact and which is fiction again, is that I remember in Uncle Donald's house there was a sword over the mantelpiece, and this sword apparently is a family heirloom. That apparently the story is that my grandfather tells is that Bonnie Prince Charlie had 5 swords made by an Italian swordsmith called someone Ferreira, I've forgotten his Christian name now. And these are famous blades that this chap came over from Italy. He was brought into Scotland to make lots of swords. But for the story to fit, Culloden was 1745, and this chap came over in the 1600s. So my grandfather says that this sword that was made by this blacksmith on commission of Bonnie Prince Charlie, given to one of his great-great-grandfathers, and this sword was then handed down through the family line. So that's my grandfather's story. But if you do the maths and work out, well, Ferreira wasn't alive when Bonnie Prince Charlie should have commissioned him. However, if you look at another side of the story, is that Ferreira set up these blacksmiths with apprentices. So the sword could have been made to the same sort of, by one of the apprentices. But
is it still around, this sword?
I'd like to ask my cousin that, because she's supposed to have it somewhere.
This is Gina.
But yes, it's Gina. But again, that's one story. Another story is that we had a relative also who fought at Waterloo. My grandfather said it was one of his direct descendants. So it is a direct descendant, but slightly off kilter from the same family that fought at Culloden. And it's possible that their sword came from Waterloo. Another side of the story is that he just bought it from a junk shop.
What's going on here? There's a perfectly worthy-looking car which seems to have been...
Well, this is going back to the christening the car Bluebird.
Okay.
So the first car here is actually that car, the Darrock, on its way to Brooklands with the riding mechanic to be christened Bluebird. But the second picture here is at a subsequent race when he's in the lead and the front wheel buckles.
Oh, I see.
And there's a hell of an accident about to happen, and my grandfather and the riding mechanic are crumpled on top of each other, and grandfather's trying to correct the steering as the rear wheel buckles as well, and they're looking at death with the railings and trees and everything else at Brooklands, but luckily at the last minute it clips a curb and slews across the line in 4th place.
Wow.
And everyone says, well, that's not so lucky anymore, is it? And he goes, well, actually, no, we should have been killed.
Yeah.
And we weren't. This car is the name Bluebird is now going to be for everything.
Yeah.
But more importantly about this picture is that almost as a direct result of that, I came into existence. Because
Don't stop now.
Because a certain Dorothy Whittle was watching this race, and it happened right in front of her, this accident. And that my grandfather then met her again 8 years later and married her, and that was my grandmother.
Wow.
So because of this accident, indirectly or directly, yeah.
Just picking up on the Campbell family fortune, whatever.
Yeah.
Of course, while all this was going on, he became an insurance underwriter.
That's right. Yes, I mean the family wanted him to go into the jewellery business, but he fought against it and went into insurance and ended up working at various places. But he was the first person to insure newspapers for libel.
Yeah, he started a whole new business model, which was
Quite successful.
Libel insurance for hacks like him. Yeah. And interestingly, for those in the audience, especially the new chief operating officer, he did that at Tysers, who are the museum's insurance brokers.
Well.
Oh, the same? Oh, I didn't realise.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's great. Yes, because he was at Tysers. Yes, yeah.
Is this a moment to be talking about, how are we, Tim? Talking about Seagrave?
No, not quite.
Not quite? Okay.
Oh, well, that's
That's the Napier.
the Napier Lion engine.
So that's the 1927 car.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
That's so handsome. Isn't
But I just love that. I mean, there's a picture later on, which I think is up on here somewhere. There we are, over there, where he's taking his hands off the steering wheel to wipe the windshield because he can't see where he's going.
Oh, yes, that's famous, isn't it?
Yeah, at 180 odd miles an hour.
So all again, wet sand flying everywhere. Yeah, whether or not he was a bounder in a cad, he was bloody brave.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Because this sort of thing, wrestling. These cars are not your power-assisted everything thing. These are very, very mechanical motor cars, and to be driving a car like that one-handed, trying to get the sand off your windscreen and goggles so you can see where
just
the
a leather flying hat, no seat belt,
Yeah.
goggles, and just a steering wheel to hold on to.
Yeah.
How fast was that?
The record was 174, give or take.
Did he take the record with
He
that?
did. Yeah,
That was
That was the 174?
Yeah.
Amazing.
On Pendine. But that was the last time, because then Parry Thomas was killed shortly afterwards trying to break that record.
Oh, I see.
And that's when Parry Thomas was out.
It's a thing of beauty, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's a shame that the car then evolved into what still was a lovely car, the 1935 Bluebird.
Yeah.
But it went through a couple of really ugly phases in between, though. Didn't
It did, yes, because again, Malcolm was a privateer. He was self-financed and didn't have the money to start all over again. And I know when you went to Reed Relton to say, well, here's my car, it needs to go faster, and Reed Relton apparently said, well, you need to start again. But my grandfather said, no, you've got this, you've got to make it work.
Yeah.
He'd already spent £20,000 or something on it at that stage, hadn't he?
Oh, I don't know if it was that much. But it probably was.
Yeah.
I mean, I think...
Was the inheritance gone?
Well, yes, possibly, but also, I mean, again, he
Sorry, the term "he" in this context is because your grandfather was a great one for making other people's money work very hard, wasn't he?
He was, yes, apparently so. I mean, there's stories of, yes, getting other people to invest in businesses that he didn't put his money in.
The basic concept was if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well with somebody else's money.
Yes, possibly, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, he was a very clever man in his own right, and I think if you can convince people to give you money to do things, then and if they're stupid enough to part with it, maybe. But yes, yeah. I wouldn't like to get drawn into too much of an argument on that.
But what we have got here, again, thanks to Tim's research, is another part, a really important element in this whole story, and as we get on to Cobb as well, it's the dependence of these guys on small numbers of really key players. And we've already mentioned Railton, who was the glue who held this whole land speed record industry together in the 30s. But Campbell had these two guys, Leo Villa and Leach.
Yes.
Who were his engineers, his factotums, the guys who really held it together. So they were the sort of supporting team that really kept Campbell's thing going, just as Ken Taylor was the man who kept Cobb's whole competition career together. And these guys in the background were really, really important.
Yeah, it's amazing. You wonder now what motivated such people, don't you? Because they were very selfless. I mean, Villa was still around when Donald was in Australia.
Absolutely.
Still.
Kept going with the tour. I mean, for Leo to have stuck with my grandfather for all that time as well, you wonder, was my grandfather that much of a draconian boss? I know there's some stories of where perhaps other people would have perhaps walked away, but Leo had the mettle to stick at it. I think Leo really enjoyed the work, and my grandfather may not have paid him as much as he should have done perhaps, but he certainly gave him lots of gifts and bought him a house and a car and that sort of thing. And there's one story where apparently my grandfather, when Leo was starting some of the racing cars, he would put the advance and retard lever at the set point, and my grandfather would be sitting in the car, and my grandfather would tweak it a little bit, and Leo would be starting the car up, and on one occasion he really badly strained his wrist, and Leo lost his temper, and Leo said, "Will you leave that lever alone?" But he shouted it really quite aggressively at him, and my grandfather shouted back, "Don't you talk to me in that tone of voice, Leo." Villa. You didn't call him Leo, he said Villa. And never again did Leo talk to him in that tone of voice. But you can see that there is a little bit of abrasion going on there all the time. But Leo says he did enjoy being a riding mechanic.
I suppose he was close to the centre, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
Sorry to be a dimwit, but which one is Leo Villa?
He's the one on our left.
Right.
Yeah,
So the right of the picture.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And this car progresses beyond.
That's 1930.
Still got single rear wheels,
30,
isn't it?
Yes, it's 32, 33.
Yeah.
Give or take a year or two.
Right.
Yeah.
And
that's it. So that's 33.
Where's that now?
Well, that evolved. So that's the first car that then evolved into the twin wheel monster that went on to Bonneville.
Okay.
And that car is now.
Other than making guest appearances on one of His Grace's arches at Goodwood, it lives at Daytona.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
In the Speedway Museum.
Yeah. And it should be somewhere else, but that's another story.
And that's Brooklands.
Yep. Every time he broke the record, almost, he came back here and did his victory lap in front of his adoring public here at the track.
Because this was the logical place to do it.
Yeah. I mean, the cars lived here.
He loved Brooklands.
Yeah.
I mean, he really thought this place was the place to be the whole time. I mean,
So this is still Napier engined, and you can see the big problem that Railton was wrestling with, that the layout of the car was such that Campbell is sitting on top of the transmission.
Yeah.
So he's sitting very high. If you look at the other cars, we're just going to come on to one in a moment, where they're designed for minimum frontal area, and this is the last of the brute force and ignorance motor cars where the driver sits on top of everything.
I see. Oh, very interesting. So
Yes, it's a shame that that there weren't a series of different cars that we could all have lined up somewhere now to just look at and be in awe of.
this is one of the great photographs, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's a young Donald,
Yeah.
and then obviously grandfather, and at the back is my grandmother. That's
yes, there she is,
1927, 28. And then there's my mum. And as I've said many times, that's the only time she's ever changed a tyre in her life, I think. And Donald. I mean, the two of them were a couple of little scallywags. They really.
What
were.
is that? What is that vehicle?
Well, they had.
Is that a scale model?
It's a Bluebird pedal car.
Well, it was. I'm not sure if that one was electric or pedal. They had pedal cars and electric cars, a little Bugatti as well,
Wow.
scaled down toys, which was just fantastic. But the two of them were, little scallywags. There's one story that I've got time quickly that, there's my grandfather used to like having a bonfire, and they would follow him around, and if he found some leaves in the garden, he would just burn them, turn a little bonfire and get it going, and then stamp it out and move on. Well, in the height of the summer, these two used to copy that. And one of them would be the person that set the fire, the other one would be the fireman to put the fire out. And they didn't realise that they set this little fire up next to a haystack. And they then argued over who was going to be the fireman to put it out. And sure enough, the real fire brigade arrived because the whole haystack went up.
60-foot flames.
Yeah, went
Oh, God.
up in smoke. But there's some wonderful stories about them getting into trouble.
Amazing.
And then Malcolm would have to punish them. I mean, Malcolm had a very strict Victorian upbringing, and I think that carried through to the way he brought up his children as well, to a degree. I think Donald got a wallop, as my mum used to say, quite regularly. But then Malcolm had a wallop quite often when he was a kid at school and with parents. It was just
Life,
life at the time.
Yeah.
But I don't think my grandfather ever hit my mum. She never ever said anything about being walloped by him. She only had good things to say about him. Whether that's rose-tinted spectacles or it's the reality of it, I just don't know. But I don't think he ever did. There's some lovely photographs of him when he's been racing here, and the children have obviously just run towards him at the end of a race, and there's a big smile on his face. He loved his kids, there's no doubt about it. I know you found Donald quite frustrating, but I think anybody would have found any Donald frustrating.
Yeah. There are various tales about Donald struggling to sort of meet his father's expectations.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
And that was seen as perhaps a motivator for what he did.
I think so. Going on to that later on, maybe, but I think Donald was, as a kid, was very accident-prone, very clumsy. I don't think he was particularly clever at school, so I think he was always a little bit of a, you could do better type thing. If you just put yourself to it, you could do
try
better.
harder.
Yeah, but he was always there, keeping an eye on and watching. And Leo used to look after him. Leo used to try and protect him.
This photograph, I think, is part of a famous set, isn't it? I've got a version of this, and in my place in London, and this is the car being displayed to the hacks, isn't it? There's a
just outside here.
Yeah,
absolutely. So that's now got the V12 Rolls-Royce engine in it, the R-Type engine.
Yeah, so this is the final version, and of course the shed outside of which it is being displayed was Malcolm Campbell's shed, which was later taken over and at this stage belonged to Thompson and Taylor.
Oh, I see.
So this is where it all happened.
More incest with the
just outside the bar.
And he got to design a proper windscreen by the look of it there too as well.
but no enclosed cockpit.
No.
You know, which would have just helped aerodynamics so much more.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the next picture is, but I mean, this car did go to Bonneville and get the record at 300.
Oh, there we are.
Well, that's Daytona. He went to Daytona first of all, and thought that Daytona would give him 300 miles an hour. But I mean, he was always beating his own record at this stage, because Henry Seagrave had been killed in 1930 on Windermere. Henry Seagrave had broken the land speed record, and I think he'd moved on to the water speed record and given up on the land. So Malcolm was only beating himself. The Americans had dropped away, and he was just inching it up. He wanted to be the first to do 200, but Seagrave beat him to that.
Yeah.
And he then wanted to be the first to do 300. And going to Daytona was a disappointment.
Yeah. There's pity that picture of the car on Daytona. The civic authorities in Daytona were desperate for people like Campbell to turn up and be a tourist attraction, and so they paid for quite a lot of stuff, including taking some of the supporting structure out of the pier halfway along the Daytona beach.
Good.
There's a pier running out into the sea, and that artificially limited the length of run that you could have on the beach. And I mean, sheer madness when you look at it now. Health and safety would have a fit. Yeah. But they took out several of the supporting struts of the pier so that he'd have a 50-foot wide gap that he could drive through at 300 miles an hour.
And that was still too narrow. I mean, can you imagine doing that? Well, it was 150 odd miles an hour, trying to steer your car on sand where you're not getting complete steering control anyway, to go through this gap. You know.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Still 301.1?
Yes. And again, that I mean, my grandfather didn't have it easy. A lot of people think that he broke records just like that, but it took him sometimes many weeks waiting for the weather and conditions to be right. And this record was hard fought and hard won as well. And then eventually, when he gets to the other end, he's done the 2A average. Tires have blown up on the way. He's been covered in hot oil, and bits of bodywork have peeled off. It's quite a challenge that he got to it. And then the timekeepers come over and say, "Congratulations, you've done 301 miles an hour. Isn't that fantastic? Great, well done." And he's been hoisted up and it's been celebrated. And then a few minutes later, they come back, the timekeepers, and say, we've made a bit of a mistake. It's 299.9 miles an hour. And my grandfather said, "Well, can't you just round it up?" And they go, "No, it's 299. And he went, "Oh, God's sake." So all of this sort of celebration was then a complete, the opposite of being celebrating. And so they then start to work out, well, how can we make this car go faster? Because, I mean, he put his foot on the accelerator all the way. And Leo used to put a block of wood underneath the accelerator to literally stop him forcing it through the floorboards on pretty much any racing car that he had, because he was so forceful with it. And they said, well, the only thing we can possibly do is actually make an enclosed cockpit to try and help the streamlining. And as they're trying to sort of sketch this out, the timekeepers come back and say, Sir Malcolm, great news. Our first calculations were correct. The second ones are incorrect, and these are now the correct figures. You've done 301 miles an hour. Isn't that brilliant? And he swears at them and says, "You actually spoilt my finest moment." Because he was so keen on being 300 and thought he'd done it. Yeah. So they have the partial celebration, and then the anticlimax.
Amazing.
And then it's back to 301.
This is a Vetriano painting, isn't it?
It is. He used that as his inspiration for Bluebird at Bonneville. Yeah.
So where's Seagrave in this? Because he's already dead, is he?
He's already yes. So we've jumped a little bit. I don't know if...
that's the trouble, because all these stories are
interlinked.
We're going to have to bounce backwards and forwards a bit.
Right.
But yeah, Seagrave, sort of real boy's own hero, from not desperately well-off background, but Eton and all that sort of thing, and sort of blonde, blue-eyed, film star looks, all that sort of thing, and
not unlike yourself, Alan.
Yeah, indeed, but perhaps not quite as good. But and he got to drive some of the amazing cars. The top one, of course, is the Slug, the
Slug.
twin-engined Sunbeam. Bodywork developed in the Vickers wind tunnel here, as were quite a lot of them.
But he was a works driver for Sunbeam.
Yeah,
is that
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So he was a natural.
Yeah, and a lot of Brooklands went into this car, even though it wasn't built here, because again the
learning, I suppose,
the streamlining side of it,
Yeah.
the wind tunnel work down here. So that car, eventually got up to just over 230 miles an hour. Twin Sunbeam aero engines, although they're not actually. Sunbeam were quite mad. They kept on building special things. Everybody else would take, we've got a great aero engine, let's use it in a car. So they did a special version of their aero engine. They sort of mucked bits and pieces around, and I think the engines in this car have only got 3 valves per cylinder, where the engine is based on had
That's
4.
right, I heard this, yeah.
And all this sort of nonsense.
Yeah.
And then they called them Matabeles or whatever they were, so that people would think they were the aircraft engine. Anyway, it was, again, big crude monster, but it did the job. Both engines driving the rear wheels, unlike the later cars where twin-engine cars, you spread the load between
Right.
4 wheels. That car obviously is now at Bewley, and they are making progress on getting one of the engines working.
That's
so
right.
that we
Yeah,
might
yeah.
actually
This
see
car
that running.
below is when they discovered
This is
the lack of frontal area.
This is Golden Arrow. This is an absolute stunner. This is
Yes,
Captain Irving's.
Is this the one that's
design.
only ever done 11 miles?
That's right. Yeah, 11 miles.
Yeah.
Literally.
Straight out of the box onto Daytona.
Did its 2 runs and never ran again. Fabulous. Designed to fit around a Napier Lion engine with the radiators and all the tankage on the side there, filling in the gaps between the wheels, so very, very streamlined. Driver sitting really low, just like a P3 Alpha, divided final drive, so the driver sat down between the propeller shafts rather than on top of the gearbox as Campbell was doing. And an absolutely stunning thing, because at this stage, the Lion is not a desperately powerful engine.
No, wasn't that one of the reasons the Slug existed? Because the Lion was running out of poke.
Yeah, well,
days.
the Lion, even in supercharged form, when Railton was using it later, he was struggling along with about 1,400 horsepower per engine. But this is an absolutely stunning bit of kit.
Yeah.
It's worth a trip to Bewley just to look at it. But it really did the biz. But Seagrave got the record and then retired from all forms of motor racing.
How long did it last, the record?
That one only
A few weeks?
a year.
Oh, a year.
Yeah, yes. It will take. Well, yes, 1929. Oh gosh, I'll have to look.
I heard an expert muttering in the corner there somewhere.
It's behind you.
Yeah.
Well, my grandfather's in 1931.
Yeah.
So yeah, a year and a half. I don't know if Ray Keach had done it had gone out before. No, that was earlier on.
But and then of course he not for the first time became a land speed record holder. Who decided to go and get the water speed record instead, and with Miss England. And
Now, according to Tim's piece of paper here, it now
there's
says
another video.
John Cobb. It says John
Yeah.
Cobb.
Ah.
So where's Cobb in all this? Where is
Right.
he? Is he learning? Is he?
Yeah. All right, let's do the video, and then we'll do the backstory.
Looks like a bank manager.
records are made to be broken. John Cobb follows the example of Sir Malcolm Campbell, who last week smashed his own water speed record. Driving his Railton car, Red Lion, over Bonneville Salt Flats, Cobb has put up the land speed record to 368.85 miles an hour. He last beats George Easton's run by over 11 miles an hour. A great performance and still a British record.
So, John Cobb, the very opposite of Malcolm Campbell, almost painfully shy, lots of evidence of lacking in self-confidence. A big guy, always a big guy, even as a school kid. He was a big kid. Lived just up the road in Esher. Long line of successful fur brokers, which is the company business, where
So self-financed.
yeah, again,
Yes,
self-financed, looking for sponsorship, but not in the way that it's done today, where the sponsors pay for your entire Formula One operation. They're looking for bits on the side from the likes of Castrol and other people.
So what were his footsteps? What would?
Yeah, really interesting. So where Campbell just assumed that he was going to be a great flyer, he was going to be a brilliant racing driver and all that sort of thing, Cobb came here initially and just watched people racing
As a kid, as a young lad.
and then plucked up the courage to offer himself up he started off as a riding mechanic to a guy called Ward with a big Fiat Grand Prix car, and eventually was rewarded with a drive in the Fiat, and did moderately well, came third in his first race, won his second race.
But didn't he assign himself to Thompson and Taylor as well? Wasn't he a junior mechanic there as well?
He said, yeah, 'cause there was a long relationship with.
And I think because they then saw something in him,
Yeah.
and that's why they sort of invested their time in him as well. As a kid.
Because he clearly had the wherewithal to get on and buy competitive motor cars, and he was being rewarded with races in other people's cars anyway. But he eventually took the big step and bought the 10.5 litre land speed record V12 Delage, the car which, if you go and sit in our 4D theatre car that we used to help make that film. And he raced that for some time, and then wanted something bigger and better than the Delage, which was not that fast a motor car. And eventually he commissioned Thompson and Taylor to build a car that would do the jobs that he wanted. Already he wanted to have the fastest racing car at Brooklands. He wanted to have a car that would race and win here and be the fastest possible, but also the car that he commissioned would be capable of breaking long distance records. I don't think he ever saw himself as being a really fast competition driver. He was the sort of the Jensen Button to a Lewis Hamilton, but he capable of very disciplined, consistent driving, which is absolutely crucial to this long distance record breaking, which is where.
And this car is the Napier Railton.
Yeah. And with the Napier Railton, he, in a magic couple of years, 1935, 1936, he set the ultimate lap record here at 143.44 miles an hour with the Railton. Then took it to Bonneville in 35, got the world 24-hour record up to 137 miles an hour. Then went back to Bonneville in 36, and that car, with a team of 4 drivers, became the first to average 150 mile an hour for 24 hours, a record that he held for about 2.5 days before Ab Jenkins got it back. But the great thing was that But Cobb got to the stage very quickly where he realised that Mr. Ebblewhite had the measure of him as the handicapper here, and he wasn't going to win races. With the car was too competitive against the other specials and so forth of Brooklands. So
Mr. Ebblewhite decided the results of things, did he?
Mr. Ebblewhite
much.
was a very insightful man, and he knew all the dodges that were going on. The people who built their engines with a whole lot of compression plates under the block, and every time you went out and raced, you took out one of the compression plates so that the car would go progressively faster all the way through. And he understood all that sort of thing. And the Railton actually raced here surprisingly a few times. There was only 8 or 9 times that it actually raced here, but won over half its races. It was spectacularly successful.
It was just better than the rest.
Yeah. More money was spent.
Why was it better? Because it wasn't necessarily engine power, was it?
No, I mean, in absolute terms, it was probably the most powerful car, other than maybe the Bimotori Alfa Romeo that was racing here at 535 horsepower, but it weighed over 2 tons, because the side rails are 10 inches deep. They're absolutely massive, even though the engine is light, only weighs 900 pounds. The car itself, and the back axle weighs as much as an Austin 7. It's a stunning thing. But
The torque output's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, 1,300 foot-pound at 1,800 RPM. Which for people who get all excited about Bentley Bentegas, having sort of 600 and something foot-pound. This is Cummins diesel
territory
stuff. But so he eventually, in 1937, he retired that car because he knew that he couldn't win more races, and that's where he changed over to tackling the land speed record. And he was the man who was brave enough and with deep enough pockets to go to Reed Railton and say, the car you want to build, I want it.
And build the amazing teardrop streamliner.
The
just before we get on to that, what do we know anything about the relationship between Cobb and Campbell?
They didn't see eye to eye, I think, is quite...
because they were different characters, mainly, or just
possibly,
rivals?
Yeah, well, they were rivals, but I mean, being the rivals, I don't think was the sort of crux of it. I just think that they just took a somewhat of a dislike to each other. Yeah. And my grandfather would be doing a public meeting, doing a speech, and he would notice John Cobb in the front row, and John Cobb would sort of sit up and make himself quite big, and my grandfather would lose the plot a bit like I feel today. So there was this uncomfortableness, and there was a story apparently of young Donald at Brooklands one day taking the spark plugs from John Cobb and immersing them in oil. Now, I don't know if that was under instructions from his father, or it was just Donald being Donald. And he said, I'll go and clean these for you in some oil, So I don't think John Cobb ever sort of saw eye to eye with my grandfather.
The sort of level of animosity or whatever grew in time rather than because at the end, of course, Cobb pretty much blamed Campbell for the decision of the board of directors of the Brooklands track to sell the track to Vickers in 1946. Campbell, having first cornered the market in shares of the Brooklands Track Company, so a large percentage of the £330,000 that Vickers paid for the site went into the pockets of one Sir Malcolm Campbell.
Well, what else could you do with the circuit then?
Although Cobb resented it enormously, he sort of regarded it as his track.
Yes.
It was the only track he ever raced on. He did record-breaking stuff elsewhere, but this was the only circuit he ever raced on. And he was a local boy, and the whole thing...
I think he raced in...
Ireland.
Ireland, was that first race.
The TT.
TT, because apparently he had I think it's a great story. He had a crash, hit a bank of soil, and the car turned upside down with his riding mechanic, and they were both thrown clear, and they were both all right. And then they were seen scrabbling around on the tarmac like a couple of madmen, and people thought, they've lost the plot here, what the hell's going on? And it's purely because the riding mechanic had lost his false teeth in the impact. Trying to find his false teeth.
But Cobb regarded that whole incident as being sort of confirmation he was absolutely right not to like small motor cars. It was a Riley Brooklands that fell over. Yeah. He didn't like small motor cars.
He probably didn't fit him too well.
Yeah, no, he didn't. He was a big man, and when he was flying flying, another of the parallels between Cobb and Campbell was that they both ended up as ferry pilots for His Majesty's Armed Forces. Campbell in the First World War, delivering aircraft to France, and Cobb in the Second World War, even though by then he was approaching 50. He was in the 88 delivering aircraft to France.
What were the difference in age?
About 15 years.
Okay.
Cobb was the younger by about, he was 1899, I think.
Yeah,
And your grandfather was
85.
Yeah. So, Cobb was too young for the First World War and too old for the second. But he acted as a...
He did stuff,
and he was regarded, unlike Campbell, he was regarded as a model flyer and a marvellous...
Well, my grandfather couldn't have been too bad. I mean, he did write a book, which was a self-published book on how to fly planes, and was made an MBE.
But again,
to crash things,
the difference was that Campbell lacked the self-confidence. He was convinced he wasn't going to be a good enough pilot, and they actually... He was in the RAF VR as flying a desk, and it took others to persuade him, and they actually flew him around in aeroplanes, persuading him that he could do this, and actually be a frontline pilot. And he ended up being the commanding officer at White Waltham. Described him as the best possible officer and an excellent influence on the rest of the pool, and never bent an aeroplane. So very, very different sort of character.
Tell us about this car.
This
is Railton's finest hour.
This is definitely Railton's finest hour. Everybody else was going to following the blunderbuss school of thought. The Campbell car at this stage has got a Rolls-Royce R, the Schneider Trophy engine, so 2,500 horsepower, whatever, and weighs about 7 tons. Easton had been breaking records with Thunderbolt, which was an 8-wheeled monster with 2 of these big Rolls-Royce engines in it, and weighed even more. And Railton designed this thing, and it weighs 3 tons. And it's got 2 of these ultralight Napier Lion engines, second-hand. They came out of Betty Carstairs' racing speedboat. So they're already old engines. They're 10-year-old engines when they went into this car.
And were they in series or?
The car had a backbone chassis, just like a Lotus Elan, but bent.
S-shaped.
Bent into an S shape, and then the engines were hung off the side, sort of pannier style.
How interesting.
And the rear engine drove the front wheels, and the front engine drove the rear wheels. No connection between the two other than the roadway, but there was a single shift lever for the 3-speed gearboxes, but they were synchronised by the fact the wheels were running on the road.
Wow.
And it had all sorts of really clever bits of engineering in it. Railton really did think this thing through. He made it ultralight. He went away from the prevailing thought that you had to have a great big tail fin to keep the thing stable and pointing in a straight line. So he got rid of the tail fin, minimal frontal area. The body you could just pick up, and to do anything on the car you had to take the body off, and it would just be picked up by a group of people and just walked away with it. This is in almost definitive form. When it first came out, it actually had an open cockpit, and they ran it a couple of times to the open cockpit at slow speeds and said, forget that, put this little conning tower on instead. And at this stage it doesn't have the fairings over the wheels, which it needed for streamlining. And again, it was such a brutally efficient design. The only space for Cobb was in front of the front axle.
As we saw.
As you saw in that unclothed picture, and that was sort of Railton really thinking it through. Everybody else sat at the back of their car, but the only place that Railton could see for him was at the front. So that's where we put him. And the big thing here was that you had the engine power divided between all 4 wheels, because the limiting factor all the way through on this, Don was talking earlier about his grandfather having tyres shredding and so forth, even at 300 miles an hour. Dunlop were doing their best to build tyres that were fast enough for the cars. And what you had to do was cut the amount of power and the amount of weight that was being fed through each wheel. So the 37 Bluebird had dual rear wheels to spread the load out. And this thing... 35 car, sorry, yeah. This is 38. So ultra streamlined, teardrop shape, everything as the aerodynamic theorists would have it. And this combination of very lightweight, no ballast in this, whereas Bluebird had lead in the back to aid the traction. And there you can see how tightly packaged it is. There's no radiators, just relies on a huge tank of ice and water. So one of the big challenges in the hour change around at the end of the first run, you not only had to change the wheels and tyres, and these things weigh 200 or 300 weight each. These are not light things to take off, but they also had to drain the water and ice tanks, and but
removing the body.
But very cleverly. You see that Railton was really thinking all the way through, and he had all this ice and water in there, keeping the engines cool, which is surplus at the end of the run because you want to put fresh ice in it. So he used that water to cool the brakes on a total loss system. So there's no braking parachutes or anything like that. They had an air brake which they discarded because they found the combination of drag and engine compression was enough to slow the vehicle down anyway, down to a couple hundred miles an hour when you could start using the brakes.
Right, I have a question actually, which a gentleman over there has asked, and I'm going to ask you, why did the front engine drive the rear wheels and the rear engine drive the front wheels on that car? What was the thinking behind that?
Probably just the geometry of arranging the drive while the front has got independent suspension and so
all the
forth.
losses and everything.
It's just a propeller shaft, but to fit in, because you've got the engine and the 3-speed gearbox and a freewheeling device, and then a secondary freewheeling device. Really clever. You had a freewheel to use instead of, so you didn't have to worry about clutches. But then the freewheel would let the engines die between gear changes, so you had an anti-freewheeling device if the engine revs dropped too far and all that sort of thing. So you had to package all that in, and it made a lot of sense to do it that way around. Okay. Yeah.
So what did this car achieve?
Okay, in the end, it got the land speed record before the war as the Railton Special, sponsored by Gilmore. We had the Red Lion on
at which venue?
At Bonneville.
Right.
Yep. And you may have noticed, just a little aside, you may have noticed in some of that stuff in the video that the car was painted black. They had to paint it black when they were out there because the timing beams didn't work on the polished alloy bodywork. They had the same problem with Thunderbolt, and so they had to paint the car black. And then the car was that was literally on the outbreak of war. And
that was 360? What was the speed?
370.
370.
Yeah, in that area.
Right. And it eventually did.
And then they brought it back, and post-war, Cobb decided that he didn't have his beloved Brooklands to race on, so he was going to go out and get the 400 miles an hour, which he and Railton were convinced was doable. Dunlop had proven that the tyres, they tested them to 480 miles an hour, I think, so everybody was sure the whole thing could do. They went out, they had a lot of problems with the post-war runs, including the almost unheard of thing of a Napier Lion engine failure when one of the camshafts on one of the engines seized. But eventually, he did the ultimate. His two-way average was 394 miles an hour, but crucially, Cobb became the first person ever to travel on land at 400 miles an hour. So Campbell was the first to 300, Cobb was the first to 400. And that record stood until Donald Campbell broke it, the official wheel-driven land speed
the 403.
In 1964.
Lake Eyre.
But I think wasn't Cobb's best average 403 as well?
His first run, his fastest run
was 403.
Was 400.
And then Donald did 403 as an average over
So
two. Yeah.
what happened to this? This car is
It's on display.
on display.
In Coventry. Birmingham.
The old Museum
Oh,
of Science and Industry,
okay.
now Think Tank, I think it's called.
Think
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jolly
And it sits there with its body raised up off, so you can actually see this
That's right.
wondrous
In fact, I've been.
mechanical packaging.
And what happened to Malcolm Campbell's career? Was it over when the war came? Or?
No, he was happy that he'd broken the 300 barrier, and people thought that he would retire from record breaking, go into politics or TV stuff or film stuff, being the presenter.
Yeah.
But he did retire from land speed record breaking and went into water speed record breaking.
Of course, yeah.
Which was even more dangerous than the land. He was happy that his car, the Bluebird, he couldn't get any more out of it, and that would mean a completely new car, and he just didn't have the funds to build a new car. And his good friend George Easton had beaten the record 2 years later, so he was happy that it was held by a Brit, but more importantly a friend, George Easton. I'm not sure what his reaction was when John Cobb beat it, but there we are. It's probably another story. And then he went on to break the water speed record 4 times.
Right.
And became the second person, like Seagrave, to hold the land and water speed records in the same year.
And we're now getting into part 2.
Okay. Well, I think that's.
the George Easton is just another fascinating Brooklands.
Yeah.
Let's do this again. We came to an abrupt end, and I think it would be marvellous to do it again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank these 3 gentlemen for a wonderful evening. I've torn the script up now, so I'm sure there are a couple of questions. If we can take them, hands up. Anyone? Gareth, I can always count on you for a question. Someone asked Don what he's doing now, by the way. Okay.
Obviously, this week we've seen the Bloodhound project grind to a halt. That's obviously massively more complicated, perhaps, than some of the land speed records we've been talking about. Do you think it's impossible to generate the funds to do record breaking these days?
It's always been impossible, I think, is the answer to that, really. And as time has got on, it's becoming more and more impossible. But there are people like Richard Noble who will continue to try and raise money to achieve these records. And without it, we need that spirit of adventure. And we need people like Richard pushing the boundaries. And we need people like Andy Green to drive these cars. I really hope that someone does come out and rescues Bloodhound. And as we said at the beginning, £25 million is a significant amount of money. But to some of the big corporates out there, it's nothing. So it is impossible. But if anyone can do it, it'll be Richard.
I went to Bristol the day after the announcement to interview the administrator. There's a story in Autocar, on the Autocar website. And the guy that is now the administrator, who's in charge of running the factory and all the rest of it, implied to me that he would only have taken the job if he had thought that there was some chance of a good outcome. So he's not there just to sell the assets. He said there are very few assets, by the way. A lot of the bits and pieces are owned by benefactors or people that are sponsors in kind. So there's nothing really to sell. The thing will be worth something if it succeeds, and their aim is to help it succeed. He also makes the point that 25 million quid is a lot less than it takes to operate the slowest car on a Formula One grid.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gives some thought, doesn't it? Another question, ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, Don is so modest, he's got some books for sale here. Okay.
Oh, did I mention that?
You didn't mention
no,
the
I didn't.
books,
No.
It's a good book, I read it.
Yes. Oh, Harry, there we go.
Where are all these cars? They seem to be sort of dispersed in different museums, some in Daytona, some in Birmingham. Is there a definitive list where all these record-breaking cars are scattered around the world?
I think it might be in the back of this book.
Hey!
just a few. I mean, it lists a few, but they are scattered around the world. But I mean,
fundamentally, Golden Arrow, the 350 horsepower Sunbeam,
the Slug,
the Slug, and the Donald Campbell's Bluebird are all at Bewley. The twin-engined Railton is in Think Tank at Birmingham.
Thunderbolt was destroyed.
Thunderbolt was burnt out, need one say, in a wall store in New Zealand during the war.
Richard Noble's 2 cars are in Coventry.
Coventry Museum, yep.
They are about.
Yeah.
My grandfather's car, the final version of it is in Daytona.
If you Google them, they'll bob up. They are around.
Yeah.
But you need to buy the book, really.
You need to buy it. $7.99.
Need to buy the book, okay?
I'll even sign it. There we
Yeah.
go.
25 quid
About the
signed.
book at all?
No, we haven't.
No, we haven't talked about the book. Another question. We'll make this the last one because I know you're all keen to win the tin of WD-40. So, any other questions? I know we've cut this off briefly, but I'm sure you 3 gentlemen will come back and revisit this. I think you're not going to even have the option, are you? One more question, maybe.
Gluttons for punishment.
One more question. No, my question is on what are you up to now, land speed record-wise?
We can probably go on to part 2 to explain that. There is another project. I mean, I do currently hold the steam car record, which was funded by Charles Burnett, who allowed me to drive his car, and that is just such a fabulous project and story. It took 10 years to do from conception to world record.
Where did you do it?
Edwards Air Force Base in California, which it was just 10 weeks of a heat wave in a desert, if you can imagine that, trying to get a steam car to work that didn't want to work, and it's a fabulous project. But Charles was investing into a new project to do 200 miles an hour, a new steam car with lots of more hydrogen-based technology, which is going to have a bearing for the future, not just for range extenders for cars, but also to generate electricity. And then Charles was killed in a helicopter crash in the beginning of the year. So we're still trying to get that project to have its own life, which luckily it does, and hopefully get a steam car to do 200 miles an hour in a year or 2.
At Edwards?
Possibly Edwards, possibly Bonneville. It will have a gearbox this time, so we won't need quite such a big run-up.
I see.
Fantastic.
And what about the lawnmower?
Lawnmower, well, yes, that was the cutting edge of technology.
That is part 2. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll round of applause for Steve, Don and Allan.
Well done, boys.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, as my normal wingman and light